Ever since I can remember, I've had a knack for solo adventures, relishing the thrill of exploring new places on my own terms. This time, my wanderlust brought me to the stunning coastlines of New Zealand for a Christmas break. The plan was simple: rent a car, drive down the coast, visit beaches and small towns, and stay in modest motels to save a few bucks. It was a perfect escape from my busy life back in Australia. I spent my days basking in the sun on pristine beaches and exploring quaint coastal towns. Each evening, I'd find a small motel to crash in for the night. One sunny afternoon, while lounging on a beach, I decided to book my next stay. A quick online search led me to Rosies Motel in a town I planned to stop at. It seemed like your typical family-run establishment, nothing fancy but good enough for a night's stay. I dialed the number listed on the website, and a woman answered. She introduced herself as Rosie, her voice warm and welcoming. "Plenty of space, love. We'll see you tonight," she said after I mentioned my plan to check in that evening. The call was brief, but Rosie's friendly demeanor left a good impression. The rest of the day flew by in a blur of sun, sand, and surf. As evening approached, I packed up and headed to Rosies Motel. The GPS took me on a dirt road that seemed to stretch endlessly into the wilderness. Doubts began to creep in as I drove, the surroundings growing increasingly desolate. Finally, the motel came into view, but it was nothing like I had expected. It looked abandoned, a relic of a bygone era, its sign, Rosies Motel, barely hanging on. The once vibrant paint was now faded and peeling, windows boarded up, the whole place enveloped in an eerie silence. Confusion set in. Had I taken a wrong turn? But the sign confirmed it. This was Rosies Motel. Maybe the owners were going through tough times, I thought, unable to afford repairs. With no other option in sight, I parked in the empty lot and walked up to the front office. My heart sank as I found the entrance boarded up, a wooden 2x4 barring entry. This wasn't just a rundown motel. It was clearly long abandoned. A chill ran down my spine. Who had I spoken to on the phone? Feeling uneasy, I got back in my car and drove to the nearest convenience store. The clerk, a middle-aged man with a friendly face, looked up as I entered. I asked about Rosies Motel, hoping for some explanation. His reaction was one of genuine surprise. "Rosies Motel? Mate, that place has been closed for years. Rosie, the owner, passed away from cancer. Sad story." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach, but I spoke to someone on the phone today, a woman. She said her name was Rosie, I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. The clerk shook his head, a mix of confusion and concern in his eyes. "You must be mistaken. No one's been at that motel for ages." I thanked him and left, my mind racing with questions. Who had answered the phone? With no other options, I drove to a nearby town and checked into a more expensive hotel. That night, sleep eluded me. The mystery of Rosies Motel gnawed at me, an unsolved puzzle that refused to let go. The next morning, fueled by a mix of curiosity and an unshakable sense of unease, I decided to return to the motel. The daylight did little to diminish its forlorn appearance. I walked around the property, half expecting to find some clue, some sign of recent human activity. But there was nothing, just the oppressive silence and the sense of abandonment. On a whim, I dialed the motel's number again, my heart pounding. The call went straight to voicemail, a generic automated message with no mention of Rosie or the motel. It was as if the conversation I had was with a phantom, a voice from the past. I finished my vacation, but the experience at Rosies Motel lingered in my mind. Once back in Australia, I did some research but found nothing that could explain what happened. Rosies Motel had indeed closed down years ago, and the real Rosie had passed away, just as the clerk had said. To this day, I have no logical explanation for that phone call or the voice that claimed to be Rosie. It remains one of the strangest experiences of my life, a mystery that defies understanding. Working the night shift at the Starlight Motel, I've become accustomed to the unpredictable nature of this job. Nestled in a sketchy part of the city, the motel has a reputation for being a magnet for trouble. As a 19-year-old college student, I took this job to pay for my tuition, braving the nightly encounters with shady characters to secure my future. The motel's dimly lit lobby, with its worn-out furniture and lingering smell of cigarettes, became my nightly refuge, where I juggled checking in guests with catching up on schoolwork. The place was notorious for incidents in the parking lot, and the rooms often served purposes far from what they were intended for. Despite all this, I had learned to manage, to keep my head down and focus on my studies amidst the chaos. One evening, as I was engrossed in my textbooks behind the counter, a man walked in with a young boy. At first glance, There was nothing particularly unusual about them, except for the fact that this wasn't the kind of place you'd bring a child. The man, tired and disheveled, asked for a room. As I processed their stay, I couldn't help but notice something off about the boy. He was quiet, too quiet for a child his age, and there was a haunting pain in his eyes, red, rimmed as if he had been crying. I handed over the key, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. The man thanked me and led the boy down the hallway to their room. I tried to return to my studies, but my mind kept drifting back to the boy's forlorn expression. Something about their interaction didn't sit right with me, but I reminded myself that it wasn't my place to pry. The hours ticked by and the motel's usual nocturnal activities unfolded. The occasional sound of a car pulling into the parking lot, the distant muffle of conversations from the rooms, and the soft hum of the neon sign outside filled the silence of the night. Around 10 p.m., the monotony was broken by the arrival of 2 police officers. They approached the front desk, their expression stern and businesslike. One of them held out a photograph of a man and a child, asking if I had seen them. A jolt of recognition shot through me. It was the man and boy who had checked in earlier. My heart started racing as I confirmed they were staying at the motel, giving them the room number. The officers exchanged a glance, their hands moving to the guns holstered at their sides. They thanked me and hurried down the hallway, leaving me standing there, my mind reeling with questions and fear. Minutes later, I heard the commotion. Shouts, the sound of a struggle, and then the man being led out in handcuffs, his face a mask of despair. The boy followed, escorted by one of the officers, his small face tear-streaked and confused. Once the situation had calmed down, the officers returned to explain what had happened. The man was wanted for kidnapping the boy, his own son, during a custody dispute. He had murdered his ex-wife before fleeing with the child. The police had been tracking him through street cameras and were checking motels and hotels in the area. I stood there, shaken to the core, realizing the gravity of what had just unfolded under this very roof. The boy, who I had noticed earlier, had been a victim of unimaginable circumstances. My role as a mere motel clerk had inadvertently placed me in the middle of a tragic and frightening situation. The rest of my shift passed in a blur. I couldn't focus on my studies or the mundane tasks of the motel. My mind kept replaying the night's events, the image of the boy's pained expression etched in my memory. When my shift finally ended, I walked out of the Starlight Motel feeling a heaviness I had never experienced before. The night had started like any other, but it turned into a chapter of someone's tragic story, a story where I'd become an unwitting participant. Recently made a trip to Bolivia to see the rainforest. We took the kids on a nice jungle adventure. We were staying in a nice motel on a river for a few days, making excursions into the jungle. On day 3, our guide asks if we want to trek to a campsite and sleep in the jungle. We got for it. We trek in 4 hours through super cool, dense jungle and encounter beautiful birds, wild pigs, snakes, and the coolest plants and trees ever. Ants and cool bugs crawled everywhere you looked. As usual, though, mosquitoes and staying dry were the only challenges. We eventually find the camp, which consists of plywood rectangles raised up on what seem like sawhorses. Each person gets a little mat, which is surrounded by mosquito netting. After dinner, we are talking about the massive spiders, poisonous, of course, on the screens inside the dinner area, which were about 3-4 inches in diameter. Their prominent eyes lit up in the light of my flashlight, and they definitely seemed to be observing us. The guide reminds us to shake out our clothing the next morning to make sure they haven't crawled into your shirt or something. He says, "Oh, those spiders are nothing. Last season we had some Germans that stayed here, and the next morning they were complaining about animals creeping around the raised plywood beds during the night." He said the next morning he found jaguar footprints all around the sleeping area from what looked like an adult. They can reach over 200 pounds. Needless to say, I went to sleep with one eye open. I stayed awake as long as I could until exhaustion turned to, "Okay, I'm too tired. If you want to eat me, then make it quick. I just can't care any longer." I remember the distinct feeling that I was going to be dragged off into the jungle in the middle of the night, and that this was a jaguar meat market, with little meals in nice little netted areas prepared for their selection. Not the best night's sleep. You can bet the next morning the first thing I did was spring up and inspect around the raised beds for jaguar footprints. From her mosquito net meat case, my wife tuned into my inspection of the area and followed me with her eye. I didn't really have to explain anything to her. When it was over, we exchanged knowing glances and I simply said, "No." We were relieved but remained exhausted all day from a stressed-out lack of sleep. As a joke, I shook out my shirt and said, "And I bet there's a giant spider who slept in my shirt." Almost on command, a huge spider whipped out of my shirt and hit the ground. I still remember the plopping sound it made as it hit the dirt and creepily scurried off for cover. I found another equally sized monster in my pants that were left on the raised platform just outside my mosquito net. That was almost 4 months ago, and even though we're back at home, I still find myself shaking out my shoes each morning to check for unwanted intruders, half expecting to hear that plopping sound as one hits the floor. Driving down the long stretch of highway from San Francisco to Los Angeles, the endless road seemed to merge with the horizon. My name's Jack, and I'm a sales rep used to long, solitary drives. But that day, exhaustion hit me like a freight train. Deciding not to push my luck, I pulled into a nondescript motel off the highway for some much-needed rest. The motel's flickering neon sign promised vacancy, a beacon of rest in the quiet night. I checked in at the front desk where a bored-looking clerk handed me the key to room 8 without much of a word. The room was what you'd expect from a roadside motel, dated decor, a musty smell, and the hum of an old air conditioner. Eager to wash off the day's fatigue, I took a quick shower and then collapsed into the bed. Sleep came easily, the kind of deep, dreamless slumber that only sheer exhaustion brings. I was jolted awake by the shrill ring of the phone. Groggy and disoriented, I fumbled in the dark, my hand finally finding the receiver. "Hello," I mumbled, more to myself than anyone on the other end. But there was no answer, only the sound of heavy breathing. It was unsettling, a raspy, deliberate sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "Hello?" I repeated, irritation creeping into my voice. Still nothing. I slammed the receiver down, a mix of confusion and annoyance clouding my thoughts. I lay back down, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. Just a prank call, I told myself. But sleep now eluded me, my mind replaying the strange call. Eventually, fatigue won out, and I drifted back into a restless sleep. It couldn't have been more than an hour later when the phone rang again. This time, my annoyance flared into anger. "What do you want?" I snapped, the words sharp and loud in the quiet room. But again, that eerie breathing was the only response. It was more pronounced now, a deliberate, menacing sound that made my skin crawl. I hung up, my heart pounding in my chest. Something wasn't right. I called the front desk, my voice tense. "Have you been calling my room?" I asked, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. "No, sir," the clerk replied, a hint of confusion in his tone. "There haven't been any calls made to your room from here." Frustration and fear mingled in my gut. I hung up, my mind racing. Was someone playing a sick game? I lay in bed, the silence of the room now a heavy, oppressive thing. Then the phone rang again. This time, I didn't answer. The ringing continued, incessant and jarring in the stillness of the night. The heavy breathing started again, this time louder, as if the person on the other end was right there in the room with me. I shouted into the receiver, my voice laced with fear and anger. "Stop calling me. Leave me alone." That's when it happened. A loud bang against the front door, like the force of a body slamming into it. The sound echoed through the room, a violent interruption in the night. I dropped the phone, terror gripping me. I ripped the phone cord out of the wall, plunging the room into silence. My heart was racing, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I peeked through the window, but the parking lot was empty, bathed in the pale glow of the motel's neon sign. I couldn't stay in that room, not with the door unprotected. I dragged the desk in front of it, barricading myself in. Then, in a panic, I locked myself in the bathroom, the small space feeling like the only safe haven. I spent the rest of the night awake, every sound sending my heart racing. As dawn broke, casting a soft light into the room, I knew I couldn't stay a moment longer. I grabbed my things, not bothering to pack properly, and rushed out of the room. Outside, the world was waking up, the early morning light bringing a sense of normalcy. But what I saw next drained the relief from me. On my car's windshield, written in the dew, were the words, "I am watching you." The letters were crude, the message clear. Without a second thought, I jumped into my car and sped away from the motel. I didn't stop, didn't look back, the fear of being followed propelling me forward. The drive to Los Angeles was a blur, my mind unable to process the events of the night. I've driven that route many times since, but I never stop at that motel. The memory of that night lingers, a haunting reminder of the terror that lurked within those walls.